This morning, we want to continue in our short study of Isaiah 40. Last week, you should have taken a couple things home with you from Pastor Blake's sermon on verses 1 through 11. One of the main things that you would have taken home with you is that Blake likes chicken fried steak at the barn. I'm partial to the chicken fried chicken, but I'm always the odd man out around here anyway. But secondly, you should have realized, and it was very clear, that the glory of God should be comforting to the people of God. And this morning's passage continues with the theme of comfort for God's people. So I ask you this morning, what brings you comfort? What brings you encouragement when you are anxious or discouraged? Where do you turn to, or who do you turn to in times of stress or worry, when trials are upon you, where you're suffering, or you're just plain old tired and fatigue that has set in, that just comes from living life and the struggles of life? One thing that is glaringly clear as you read from Genesis to Revelation is that life for God's people is filled with trials and suffering and hardships, and it is filled with pain and sorrow at times. Ease and safety are never promised to us, but comfort is. And not the comfort that comes from a lack of hard times, but a comfort that comes in the midst of it. Not a comfort that comes from absence of trial, but a comfort that comes in the presence of truth. Not a comfort that comes from the things of this world, but a comfort that comes from something much greater than this world. A comfort that is eternal and not temporary. See, for most of her existence, Israel chased the cheese of worldly comfort, and time again, she got caught in the trap. Israel continued to look to her neighbors and copy them. She saw the success and the power of the pagans and sought comfort in their religious systems. See, Israel constantly refused to worship God alone. She refused to be loyal to Him alone, comforted by Him alone. Israel's whole existence, except for a couple kings and a few years here and there, was known for this evil pursuit. God had said and made it clear that they were to have no other gods before Him. God desired to be their God and for them to be His people, and yet through His constant reminders and proving Himself over and over and time again, they pursued the gods of their neighbors. See, for Israel, Yahweh alone was not enough. The idea of Yahweh alone was too radical. It was too weird. No other nation had only one God. And no one God is big enough or powerful enough or in charge of enough areas in life to satisfy all of our needs and wants, so she thought. So many times and often you read about Israel's adultery that she caused with the gods of the other nations. In addition to this idol worship, we've seen Israel refuse to trust God alone. And Isaiah points this out as one of the things that they are being judged for. Israel's kings often made alliances with Assyria and Egypt and Babylon. They trusted in these nations to protect and defend them and their land. They trusted in these nations to protect and defend God's own people and God's own land more than they trusted God to do it. In fact, at this time in history, ultimately, wars were not necessarily viewed between nation and nation, but between one nation's God and another nation's God. So when Israel aligned herself with another nation, she was trusting in that other nation's God more than hers. This alliance proved that Israel's belief that whatever country she was aligned with, that those gods were more able to protect and defend Israel than Yahweh was. Ultimately, then, Israel's alliance with other nations was a rejection of Yahweh. Israel sought comfort in the worship and trust in the gods and nations that Yahweh had time and time again proven himself to be greater than. And now, as a result of this, she finds herself in a trap. The Assyrians have decimated the northern kingdom and most of the southern kingdom. And they have pillaged and they have destroyed many of the cities. They've taken over the farmlands and carried off the goods and the people to another land. And now the Babylonians have entered onto the scene and they've finished the job by doing the same with the remainder of the Jews in Judah and Jerusalem. And so God, in upholding his promise of judgment, which he warned of, which he warned these people in Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28, he removes these people from the land. Total destruction and captivity. God's heavy hand of judgment has fallen. And now God is telling Isaiah to write to the people who will be living several hundred years in the future. He's writing to these exiles in Babylon, and God says, comfort them. Not with promises of ease and safety, but comfort in the God who both judges and shows compassion. Last week in Isaiah 41 through 11, Pastor Blake showed us that God encourages his people by showing his glory to them and his comfort for them that he gives to his people. And this week we continue in Isaiah 40. So please stand with me as we read verses 12 through 31 in Isaiah 40. We'll read this together, and then we'll see what Isaiah has for us and what God has for us today. Isaiah 40, beginning in verse 12. Isaiah says, "Who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand, and marked off the heavens with a span, enclosed the dust of the earth in a measure, and weighed the mountains in scales and the hills in a balance? Who has measured the Spirit of the Lord, or what man shows him his counsel? Whom did he consult, and who made him understand? Who taught him the path of justice, and taught him knowledge, and showed him the way of understanding? Behold, the nations are like a drop in a bucket, and are accounted as the dust on the scales. Behold, he takes up the coastlands like fine dust. Lebanon would not suffice for fuel, nor are its beasts enough for a burnt offering. All the nations are as nothing before him. They are accounted by him as less than nothing and emptiness. To him then will you liken God, or what likeness compared with him? An idol. A craftsman crafts it, and a goldsmith overlays it with gold and casts it with silver chains. He who is too impoverished for an offering chooses wood that will not rot. He seeks out a skillful craftsman to set up an idol that will not move. Do you not know? Do you not hear? Has it not been told you from the beginning? Have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? It is he who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them like a tent to dwell in, who brings princes to nothing and makes the rulers of the earth as emptiness. Scarcely are they planted, scarcely sown, scarcely has their stem taken root in the earth when he blows on them, and they wither, and the tempest carries them off like stubble. To whom then will you compare me that I should be like him, says the Holy One? Lift up your eyes on high and see who created these. He who brings out their hosts by number, calling them all by name, by the greatness of his might, and because he is strong in power, not one is missing. Why do you say, O Jacob, and speak, O Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord, and my right is disregarded by my God? Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint, and to him who has no might, he increases strength. Even youths shall faint and be weary, but young men shall fall exhausted. But they who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Let's pray. Father, as we read words like we read in Isaiah 40, how can my mere words do justice to how you describe yourself? How can the mere words of man truly portray your majesty and your sovereignty and your faithfulness and your glory? Father, I can't. We can't. So we call upon your Spirit to take these words and to enlighten our minds and our hearts and teach us, to show us, to just give us a glimmer of your beauty and your majesty. Lord, may these words comfort us today. I pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen. If you remember from last week, Isaiah is writing to the men and women who will one day be exiled in Babylon. And his purpose is to comfort them in this time, in these hardships, in these days of discouragement and despair. But in bringing them comfort, all he does is just simply points them to the character of God. So this morning we're going to see how Isaiah lays out three attributes of God that comfort his people in the hard times in life. The first attribute we see is found in verses 12 to 20. And he points us to God's majesty. And in doing so, he presents or he asks a series of three questions. The first question is asked in order to really remind us of God's omnipotence. And the second two then are to draw our minds and our thoughts to his omniscience. See, in verse 12, we see his omnipotence. Isaiah points to God's omnipotent majesty by drawing then our attention to God's creation. And he sets it up for us in a sense of how we view creation and then how God views creation. He says, in one way, to consider the waters of the earth. Our perspective, we know that the waters of the earth cover just over 70% of the surface of the earth. 140 million square miles. There are 322 million cubic miles of water in volume on the earth. The deepest point in the ocean, water pressure is more than 8 tons per square inch. That would be like you laying on your back and us putting 50 jumbo jets on your chest. It's just vast amounts of water. Gallon after gallon after gallon. Imagine trying to empty one of those oceans with a bucket. It's a ridiculous thought. It's unimaginable. It's unfathomable. But who holds all of this water in the palm of his hand? It's God. How about the heavens? How about the universe and all in it? Our galaxy, the Milky Way, alone is so vast that it would take 100,000 years traveling at the speed of light, which is 186,000 miles per second, I believe. It would take 100,000 years to travel from one end of our galaxy to the other, and that's without making any stops. And with my family and the thumb-sized bladder that a couple of them have, it would take us 5 times that long. And on top of that, one of our neighboring galaxies is then 2.3 million light years away from where we're at. Just unimaginable. We can't even wrap our minds around the size of our universe. It's so vast, it's huge. And Isaiah tells us that it is God who measures the universe from the tip of his pinky to the tip of his thumb. How about just the earth itself? Two scientists from the University of Washington estimated that the earth weighs somewhere around 5.972 sextillion tons. What is sextillion? It's a made-up number. That's a 5 and a 9 and a 7 and 2 with 18 zeros behind it. And you look at the Rockies, and they pale in comparison to the Himalayas. We really have no way of knowing how big these things are because we have no way of measuring them because we are so small and insignificant. And they are so vast and huge. Who can really measure the earth? Who can weigh these things out? Who actually has the weights and measures to really know the earth's size? God does. We have to make up numbers in order to describe God's creation, yet all of it sits comfortably in his hand and well within his own power. Isaiah is doing much more here than pointing us to the size of God. He is describing God's majesty. None of this is hyperbole. Isaiah is not saying this and using exaggeration for effect. In fact, his descriptions of God are still underestimations of who God really is. From there, Isaiah moves on to God's omniscience. The Hebrew word that we have translated measures in verse 13 is different than the one translated the same way in verse 12. In verse 13, it means to direct. So Isaiah asks, who directs the Spirit of the Lord? Who shows him? Whom does God consult? Who taught God or gives him understanding? And the obvious answer is no one. No one is God's equal in wisdom and understanding. Paul tells us in Romans 11, oh, the depths of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments and how inscrutable his ways, for who has known the mind of the Lord? No one is God's equal. God's majesty is over the heavens and the whole universe. His majesty is over the whole earth. And now Isaiah tells us, and he continues to point us to God's majesty by comparing him to the mere nations of the earth. He's showing us just how insignificant the nations around the Israelites really are. In comparison to his majesty, the nations are just a drop in the bucket. In fact, all the lumber and animals in Lebanon would not be able to make a sacrifice worthy of God's deserved praise and honor. And in all of this, please note that Isaiah is not limiting the vastness of the heavens or the wisdom and knowledge of man or the size of the nation. But by comparing these things to God, he's proven the majesty of God. A majesty that is incomparable to anything else. So what in your mind is the most majestic thing you can think of? For those of you who gave the little Sunday school answer, Jesus, good for you. But even your most biblically accurate thoughts of Jesus are nothing compared to his true and glorious majesty. We cannot know his full majesty and glory and beauty. All of this point in verses 18 and 20. Look at those with me. Isaiah asks, to whom then, in light of his omnipotent majesty, in light of his glorious beauty, in light of His omniscience, who will you liken God to? Or what would you compare Him with? An idol? A craftsman crafts it, and a goldsmith overlays it with gold and casts for it silver chains. He who is too impoverished for an offering chooses wood that will not rot. He seeks out a skillful craftsman to set up an idol that will not move. See, for generations, this is what Israel, God's people, had done. They had likened the all-majestic God to an idol. The very God who holds and measures and weighs the universe, who is more majestic than the eye can see or imagine. The very God who is omniscient. He is all-wise and all-knowing, who has never been taught or learned one thing, who has never been surprised or shocked, has been compared to an idol. These idols are worthless. Whether you are rich or whether you are poor, it doesn't matter. In fact, Isaiah says at the end of verse 20 that if the idol is not made skillfully, it won't even be able to stand on its own. Men and women who couldn't survive 3 days on the water that they can hold in one hand think that they can create a God who is greater than the one who holds all the water in His. And Isaiah is declaring enough. Enough of this foolishness. Yahweh is your God. The one true God is incomparable in His majesty, and that is where your comfort should come from. Stop relying on these idols that know less than the one who formed them. Turn the eyes of your hearts to Yahweh, because He is incomparable in His majesty, and Him alone comes comfort. So again, what brings you comfort? Your own ability? Your own willpower? Cinching up your belt another notch? I can handle this. I can get through this. Brothers and sisters, until God is considered all majestic, until He is believed to be greater than all else, then you won't find your comfort in Him. The idol of self-might only satisfies for a moment. The idol of ease won't bring true comfort, and the idol of safety will one day topple over. The incomparable majesty of God points us to the fact that He is over all and that He reigns. Period. So what in your life is bigger than God? What in your life is out of God's domain? It's out of His control. And what in your life do you think you need to instruct God in? So often, I believe our trials and suffering and pain and sorrow, it clouds our vision of His majesty. And all we can see is the circumstances around us. We allow our trials to become our small hand, and we cover our eyes with it, and it keeps us from seeing the beauty and the vastness of His creation and who He is. We have to be able to see our trials for what they truly are. 2 Corinthians chapter 4, Paul says this in regards to the afflictions of this life in this earthly body. He says, "So we do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day." He says this, "For this light, momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal." See, Paul lived with the right perspective between his temporary life and the eternal glory. What happens here is light and momentary, he says, compared to the eternal weight of glory. So he says, look to eternity. Look to the unseen. Move the clouds of the temporary circumstances to the side so you can see the whole glory of God's majesty. Only when our light and momentary afflictions are viewed in the right perspective, in comparison to God's majesty, will we be able to find comfort in God. That's where our comfort starts. Dwelling and basking in the majesty of God, grabbing hold of Him and relying on Him, knowing that all else will fail. Only then will our comfort be real in eternity. Brothers and sisters, He is over all. He is above all. And you and I can take comfort in knowing that He knows all. And in times of trial and hardship, we need to remind ourselves, preach these things, the truths of God's majesty to ourselves. Verses 21 to 26, Isaiah shifts gears a little bit, and he shifts his focus off of the incomparable majesty of God to the incomparable sovereignty of God. So again, for the men and women in exile who would have been living under the heavy hand of Babylon, all hope would have been lost. It would seem that they were at the mercy of the leader of the most powerful nation on the face of the earth. Once a free and prosperous people, the Jews were now slaves and considered filth. They were despised by those who owned and now controlled them. To the exiles, the rulers of Babylon were the victors and were now the sovereign rulers over all things. It was Babylon who had all the power. It was Nebuchadnezzar who had all the authority. And now despair and hopelessness and shame was the world that the Jews lived in. This was their life now, and there didn't seem to be any light at the end of the tunnel. The future was just as dark and hopeless as the present. But Isaiah's message is one of comfort. And again, he begins with questions, not so that these people will answer them, but so that these people will think deeply about the difference between what they believe and what they should believe, how they view God and how they should view God, what they are misunderstanding about God and how He reveals Himself truly to them. And He's calling them to remember that they have heard and been told regarding creation, and more importantly, its Creator. And He does this by a side-by-side comparison of God compared to man and his leaders. He says it is God who sits above, but it is man who's like a grasshopper. God is the one who put the skies in His place, and mankind lives under it. Yahweh is the sovereign ruler of all things. To Him all authority and power and rule is given. He is the one who brings man's princes and rulers to nothing and emptiness. These are the answers to Isaiah's questions. God's sovereignty over all things should be what comes to these people's minds when the hopelessness of man's laws bear down on them. And Isaiah further describes Yahweh's relationship to earthly rulers. It says they are like a crop. Yahweh plants and sows. He puts the one in power whom He chooses. And He uses that ruler to accomplish His purposes. And when he is through, the man is gone. The rulers of earth are just pawns in Yahweh's hand that He uses to fulfill His glorious purposes. And Isaiah reminds us of this in chapters 36 and 37. He tells us of how God raised up the Assyrians and made the Assyrians into the most powerful nation in the world. A great and mighty nation. And He used them then to judge the northern kingdom. And He even sent them into Judah. And coming to Jerusalem, Assyria's king Sennacherib, he mocks God, and he declares that Judah's God is not strong enough to defeat Assyria's mighty army. What a mistake. Because God then strikes down 185,000 soldiers in Sennacherib's army, and the king has no choice but to return to Nineveh with his tail between his legs. His army is gone. And to add injury to insult, Sennacherib is then murdered by his own sons as he's worshiping one of his gods. And it's not long after this that Assyria then is replaced as a world power by the Babylonians. Scarcely had Sennacherib been planted and sown. Scarcely had he taken root and God blew. The king withered and was blown off like stubble. God raised him up, accomplished his purposes through him, then God removed him. This king, the most powerful man in the world, had no authority or power over Yahweh. He was not sovereign. God continues to do this as you read through the Old Testament and the history of Israel. He does the same thing with Babylon's ruler, Nebuchadnezzar. He is raised up by God for the purpose of judging Judah. He is then overthrown by the Persians and their king Cyrus. And of Cyrus, God says in Isaiah 44:28, hundreds of years before Cyrus would even be, hundreds of years before the Persians, hundreds of years before the Babylonians would come to Israel, Isaiah, through the Holy Spirit, prophesies, and he calls the Persian king by name Cyrus. And he says, Cyrus shall fulfill my purpose. And it is this king, it is Cyrus then that will send the Jews back to their land and will rebuild Jerusalem in the temple. Isaiah's point is clear. That God is sovereign. Not man or princes or the rulers of the nations. And as if his point hasn't already been made clear enough, he continues. In verse 25, Isaiah quotes God, and God asks, "Whom will you compare me that I should be like him?" Certainly not Sennacherib, Nebuchadnezzar, Cyrus. Again, not a question that is designed to get a quick Sunday school answer, but one to cause deep consideration of the characters and attributes of God. These nations and rulers who have and are causing this deep despair and hopelessness, they're nothing. They're under the control of the incomparable God's sovereign hand. And then Isaiah points their attention back off of the earth and back to the skies. You have any questions on God's sovereignty and his control and rule over the nations and rulers? I'll show you even something else, Isaiah says. Look to the skies. And he refers them and draws their attention to the stars, which he refers to as a host. This word host oftentimes refers to a vast army of men who are under orders and do what they are told. Again, with our naked eye, we can only see about 6,000 stars on a clear night. But it's estimated that there's somewhere between 100 billion and 400 billion stars in our galaxy alone. A little bit of a margin of error there, right? But no matter how accurate these numbers are, we know that each and every star has been created by God. Each and every star has been numbered by Him. They have been named, and each one of them is exactly where He has placed them. Even the stars are under the authority of His incomparable sovereign hand. Even the stars do what they are told. The author of Hebrews tells us that He upholds the universe by the word of His power. Paul tells us in Colossians 1, in him all things hold together. The stars are right where they are commanded to be, and not one of them will move 1 inch. Not 1 inch, unless God tells them to. And each and every ruler and government has been and will be sovereignly placed in power by God. And he is not surprised by the evil. He is not surprised by the good, because all of it is under his authority and power and rule. And their purposes may be for evil, but he will use them for good. No ruler, no nation, nothing that has been created is outside of God's sovereign rule. The stars don't even do what they want. Therefore, brothers and sisters, we can find comfort in the fact that whatever we're going through is under God's sovereign control, and it will be used for our good and his glory. Paul reminds us of this in Romans when he says that all things, not some things, all things work for good for those who love God and are called by God. God's people can declare along with Joseph that what man means for evil, God will use for good. And this is why James can tell us to consider it joy. Really, James? Joy when we have trials? Absolutely. Because God is in control. Not because of the trial, but because of what God does in the heart and soul of his people through his control of the circumstances. So I think there's maybe more. But I think of 2 reasons why God's incomparable sovereignty would not be comforting to you. First, you may not truly believe he is sovereign. Circumstances that you are in right now are outside of his control, and all he can do is sit back and hope for the best. You believe your circumstances are up to fate, up to chance. If you believe this way, this is not a God you can trust. If you believe this way, this is not a God that you can hope in. This is a powerless God. This God brings no comfort. This is really no God at all. Second reason you may not be comforted by God's sovereignty is that you don't really want what he wants. You don't treasure the things God treasures. Your idea of good is different than God's idea of good. You want ease and safety, maturity and growth. Take it or leave it. God's glory? Nah, I want mine. See, when God's sovereignty is not comforting to us, we have a problem. We have to reorient our minds and hearts with God's character. He is in control and has authority over all things. He is good and all-wise. And when we believe the truth of who God is and that all he does is consistent with his unchanging character, then that is always best. And his sovereignty will be a comfort to us. It is comforting to know that this incomparable God is not subject to anyone or anything. In all things, even the hardship in our lives are under his control and part of his purposes. Finally, verses 27 to 31, in these last 5 verses, we really begin to see the despair of the exiles. They become faint and they're without might. They are weary and exhausted. Their circumstances are perceived as hopeless, and these people are completely at their wits' end. In verse 27, it is implied that much of this despair and hopelessness comes from the belief that God is through with them. They don't believe that he sees their situation, or they don't believe that he cares. They believe he's grown tired of them, or that he's turned his back on them, and now he is apathetic to their plight. Gleason Archer kind of helps us understand why these people might be feeling this way. In his Old Testament survey, he says that up until this time in history, exiled people, once they were removed from their land, it was over. Exiles don't return to their nation. They don't return to their land, and they certainly don't become a sovereign nation again. And these people knew that. There was virtually no hope in a restored Israel in the eyes of these exiles. God had been defeated, and God was now through with them. But Isaiah points them back once again to their incomparable God by reminding them of God's otherness and His faithfulness. Yahweh is not bound by time. He is everlasting. Yahweh is not bound by space. He created the ends of the earth and sits above them. Yahweh is not limited by the physical or anything that might cause Him to be tired or weary. Yahweh is not limited by man's wisdom or the norms of history. He's not controlled by anything. He is free to act in any way that He desires. He is bound to no one except for one thing, and that is Himself. He is bound to His own character. And that's why the author of Hebrews tells us it's impossible for God to lie. He is truth. Therefore, He cannot lie. It's not His character. James tells us He does not tempt. God is bound to His character, and Isaiah is reminding these exiles that just as God had to be faithful to His promise to judge, He will be faithful to His promise to restore. God will not forsake His people. He will not waver in His promised love. He will not break His covenant with Israel. He will be faithful to all He has promised to these men and women. God after God of the nations had failed and been unable to live up to their promises, but not Yahweh. Not the God of Israel. Their way is not hidden from Him. Their right has not been disregarded because He is incomparable in His faithfulness. We have seen God's majesty in this passage. We've seen His power, His omniscience. We've seen His sovereign hand and how He is in control of everything. He is nothing like us. But notice how personal and intimate Isaiah shows us God is. There's a compassion and a care and a regard and a comfort for those who trust and rely upon the Lord to accomplish what He says He will do. There is power given to the faint. There is strength to the weary. There is strength to the weak and energy to the weary. And it is given to those who what? Who wait on the Lord. This idea of wait is not one of idleness and laziness, but it communicates the idea of waiting with an eager hope. An eager hope for the Lord's promises to be fulfilled. Waiting involves a confident expectation of God's hand. And it's this eager expectation that then revives the soul. It gives strength to the weary and hope to the hopeless. See, these exiles were in despair and were hopeless because they had forgotten the incomparable God. And they had forgotten that He is incomparable in His faithfulness. And Isaiah is telling them to wait for Him. Eagerly hope in Him. He will act. So be comforted by this incomparable God who is faithful. As you continue to read Isaiah, he then communicates and he tells these men and women of God's faithfulness in what He is going to do for them. He will do what has never been done before. He is going to bring an exiled people back to their land and restore them as a nation. Some of you here today are weary. Some of you are tired. You are faint. You are weak and you are exhausted. Life for you right now is hard. Others of you know what it's like to go through trial. And the rest of you, if you don't, You will one day, more than likely. Whatever your case is, in these times, our comfort can come from knowing and waiting on God. Grab hold of His promises and trust Him. Trust Him to be faithful. John 14, Jesus says He promises that He will be back one day. Paul to the Romans describes our salvation and what glorious promises we have. We are justified, we are reconciled, we are called, and we will one day be glorified. And all things in our lives are moving us to this glory, which is our good. We are also promised that there is no condemnation for those who are saved. John tells us that one day we will see Him as He is. You want to know how to be strong in trial and not grow weary from the things of this world? Isaiah would tell you to take your eyes off your circumstances. Take the eyes off of your circumstances and look to God's character. Run your race with your eyes on Jesus and not down at your feet. So again, I ask you, where do you find comfort in the hard times in life? Our comfort should come from our God, who is incomparable in majesty, He's incomparable in sovereignty, and He is incomparable in His faithfulness. Looking to the incomparable God is not just something that Isaiah thinks will bring him comfort. The author of Hebrews tells us to look to Jesus as our example as we run this race of life. He is the one that had endured the shame of the cross because the seat of the Father's right hand was in view. Fortunately, I don't think that we're all that unlike the Israelites. We oftentimes chase this cheese of worldly comfort. We seek comfort in so many things other than our incomparable God. And when the ways of life begin to beat us around, we often reach and grab hold of a Dollar General water noodle instead of the rock or the shield, the steady anchor who is our incomparable God of comfort. And unfortunately, too often, we throw the same noodle to our brothers and sisters who are going through hard times. Like Isaiah and the many other examples we find in Scripture, we need to believe and trust that the most encouraging truths and the most comforting truths for the Christian are those that point our hearts and minds to the person and work of Jesus and the hope that we have in Him. And grab hold of them. Don't let it stick in your minds and just be knowledge. Let it infiltrate your heart and motivate you to worship and to believe. As the men come forward this morning to serve the elements of the Lord's table, we want to be reminded of these things. We want to be reminded of the hope that is ours in Christ. That the hope that we have comes from the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. And as we eagerly anticipate and wait for this hope to become reality, we comfort one another with these truths. The truths of our incomparable God of all comfort. See, the cross is where we see God's justice being met as the Son's body was being crushed and His blood was spilt under the wrath of the Father. And all for the purpose of the Father's glory and our good. So that one day we would be justified and one day we would be glorified and spend eternity with Him. And it's because of Jesus' life and death and resurrection that we who are saved might wait with this eager expectation for the fulfillment of every one of God's promises to be fulfilled. And it's the cross that reminds us of God's majesty, God's sovereignty and faithfulness. Therefore, there's great comfort in remembering. So today we want to remember this act of love. We want to remember the cross and the compassion that produces worship and gives us comfort together as we share in the Lord's Supper with one another.